So now let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Kees van der Pijl. He's Professor Emeritus at the University of Sussex from the Department of International Relations. He was also the director of the Center for Global Studies. Kees is a man of many, many facets, only some of which I think I can recall here. Most of us, of course, know him as a scholar, the author of many really important books that have transformed the landscape of the critical study of international relations and of international political economy. I'm thinking here, of course, of his first major work, The Making of the Atlantic Ruling Class. I'm thinking of other really important works like the book on transnational classes, the book on global rivalries, and finally his very important Deutsche Prize-winning trilogy of books on a critical perspective on international relations, organized around the groundbreaking concept of modes of foreign relations. Kees's scholarship ranges very widely. In fact, if you read it, you will see that it requires considerable mastery of history, of political economy, of culture and literature, of course of international relations, his home discipline and politics, but many other things. And I should add that in his spare times, Kees also writes novels, which we don't have the privilege of reading unless, of course, we read Dutch. I always find when I read Kees's work that it's an intellectual treat because it combines, as very few people can do, an attention to factual detail, which is married in a very harmonious marriage, I should say, with theoretical and conceptual ambition. And it is this ambition, of course, that has yielded these ideas such as transnational classes, modes of foreign relations, and of course the theme on which he will speak today, the idea of permanent counter-revolution. I guess I should end by saying that Kees's work is also characterized by an abiding political commitment to the left and progressive causes. And so he's continuing his, he's demonstrating this commitment these days by his work in the Dutch Anti Fascist Resistance, of which he has also served as president, and where he's bringing to a broad popular movement his critical approach to Western, European, and Dutch foreign policy. And I should add that we are very proud at the Geopolitical Economy books that one of Kees's works entitled Prism of Disaster, which is about, it is about the situation in Ukraine, with Ukraine, Russia, and the downing of Malaysian Airlines 17. So without further ado, I would like to invite Kees to come and give his speech. I see Kees has slightly changed his title, but I have no doubt that we are in for just the same intellectual treat as we ever were. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Radhika. I'm always a bit taken aback by this sort of introduction, because I think if I were in the audience, I would think it can only disappoint. You know, he's getting older. But it is a great welcome, and I was actually also moved.
Is the microphone working?
No, it isn't.
Turn it on. Oh, I know.
Well, the most moving part of what I was going to say, I just said without the microphone. I was also moved by the welcome of the Aboriginal representative, because it gives you a sense that time is much more layered than we think when we say there's a 100 years anniversary. These people arrived somewhere 15,000 years ago, and the idea that we should worry at all about a 100-year anniversary becomes a bit strange if we don't take into account that other dimension. But it will only force on us to begin to think in these about these matters in a deeper way, and I think also to see the variety of angles from which you can approach the events that we will be talking about. Now, when I say the Russian Revolution at 100, there's of course very little to celebrate. You know, there are no dances here. I didn't bring musical instruments because the Russian Revolution is gone. It's gone in a much more profound way, I would say, than the French Revolution has, which has left us with more enduring structures that still play a large role in our lives. And the subtitle that I, without consulting Radhika, introduced here is Revolt and Counter-Revolution, and that will be my theme, because against the explosion of popular discontent after 3.5 years of murderous First World War in the trenches, you know, that still resonates in many ways, but it hasn't left enduring structures. It has actually ended up in the context of a world historic defeat. We live in a conjuncture of profound defeat that you can only understand if you have also been part, or at least witnessed from a distance, the 1960s resurrection of Marxism and the almost explosion then of the labor movement. And from that period, so from that period of activism in the 1960s, many people, including myself, came away with the idea of living in an era of transition from capitalism to socialism. And the idea was that the Russian Revolution had kicked off this enormous historical process, and from one decade to the next, further installments of this process would happen, and at some point, well, we would all be living in a happy socialist world, because with every new socialist revolution covered by this barracks-like, somber state socialism of the East, with every revolution it would become more Cuban, so to speak, more sunshine, more fizzy drinks, and other things that we don't immediately associate with socialism, but when they are added, as Henry Heller reminded me yesterday, that François Brodel once said, the historian Brodel, socialism cannot exist without restaurants. You said it yesterday, and I think it's a worthwhile reflection, because we need that festive aspect to a new society. Will it ever be appealing and not just negative phenomena? Now, the perspective of the evolutionary perspective of an era of change from capitalism to socialism hasn't happened. We now must adopt, I think, the perspective of what I call a permanent counter-revolution. And that has been the stronger process. It has been able to absorb and defeat, not just defeat, but absorb and defeat the impulses of the occasional revolts of momentous consequences, but nevertheless revolts in the longer perspective. I'll be speaking on 5 aspects, because counter-revolution is an external phenomenon, in the sense that whenever a revolution happens, powerful forces range against it and will try to defeat it. You might also call, as Arno Meyer, whom Radhika already mentioned, has distinguished between anti-revolutionary movements and counter-revolution. So anti-revolution is simply that you resist what is happening to the society you were familiar with, and that may be without any deeper conviction about where history should be moving or whatever. Counter-revolution means that you want to roll back what has happened and keep in place a different type of society. So counter-revolution is external in the sense that you're attacked from the outside as soon as you want to do something else. I just heard a fascinating presentation about the leader of Burkina Faso, who was murdered after 4 years of trying to do something quite different. Now, that's what you call external counter-revolution. Internal counter-revolution is almost equally important, because it means that when your attempt at changing society suffers defeat, that defeat is woven into your understanding of what your revolution was about. And I give some examples of how the doctrine of various doctrines and editions of Marxist doctrine have included these internal counter-revolutions in the sense that they were backpedaling on the sort of revolutionary consciousness that is necessary to bring about that new society and involve not just a small elite, but the population as a whole. And then we'll be speaking about the specifics of the Russian Revolution, the post-war counter-revolution led by the West, which is very important because I would say that the West, and by that I mean the Anglo-American core, and Radhika kindly already referred to the Atlantic ruling class, which I still think is the hard core of the world reaction, so to speak, with a particular vicious role by the British. I hope I'm not insulting any people from the British Isles here, but in these days, with America so big and Trump so ugly, we tend to underrate the intelligence and the malicious scheming that has been brought to the whole enterprise of counter-revolution, specifically by the British. But it was led by the West, as I say here, and then to end not entirely on a pessimistic note, I end with the crisis of the West, because today is, of course, particularly the Anglo-American axis that is becoming disabled, both by Brexit on the one hand and by the election of Trump against an, in my view, equally horrible candidate, whom we better forget now. So first, on the external counter-revolution. I would say that 1848 was the breaking point in the process of creating this counter-revolutionary momentum, because it's at that point that the series of bourgeois revolutions, which were the revolutions that, again I quote Radhika, ushered in capitalism, so the Dutch, the English, the revolutions of Spanish America, the French Revolution, and, well, the Swiss shouldn't be forgotten entirely either. These revolutions were supported by the mass of the population. So the bourgeoisie and the commercializing aristocracy led the movement, depending on every situation was slightly different. The large mass of the population supported it. In 1848, of course, as we all know, for the first time, the labor movement appeared on the scene as an independent political force and wanted to add its accent to the changes. But, and I have two quotes from Marx that I wrote, and the first one is that Marx commented on the revolutions of 1848, and you will recall, you know, there was a revolution in Paris, there were revolutions in various other countries, Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on and so forth, and Marx said the contribution of 1848 to the world historical process should not be judged by its own tragicomical accomplishments. I almost learned the quote by heart, but now I read. But by the solid, powerful counter-revolution it provoked. And I would say it didn't just provoke a solid counter-revolution, but it provoked the permanent counter-revolution. So it set in motion a process which eventually evolved into almost an art form, in the sense that as soon as the antennas of, and I say just Atlantic ruling class as shorthand, it's always more complicated, etc. But as soon as the antennas of this central block in the, covering the Atlantic picked up signals of serious social change, they developed responses to it, which almost always nipped it in the bud. But almost always also their intervention entailed massive massacres and crimes against humanity, but we'll get to that later. So 1848 was not so much a big revolution, because the big French Revolution had already been. It was more or less a constitutional makeover of the same system, and it spread across Europe and into Latin America in particular, but there was a powerful counter-revolution. And each revolution since has been characterized by this long sentence that follows, and that is that it wasn't just reaction. It wasn't just that the counter-revolution picked up an enormous mallet, ran after the revolutionaries and tried to quash them. But it was a more subtle process in which the popular aspirations were assimilated into the counter-revolutionary project. And only that allowed it to become a permanent process, because without a mass consensus, a consensus among the layers of the population that you need to, to rule any society, a process of this magnitude could never have been sustained. So the things that, or the aspects of this of these popular revolution are mentioned here. They were mobilizing religion, mobilizing war, mobilizing nationalism. In brief, imperialism. You know, imperialism as a term, well, it goes back to the Roman Empire, of course, but it became again a term with a certain currency after the experience with Napoleon III, the nephew of the great Napoleon. And Napoleon III has left us with very instructive documents in which he explains that the only way to keep the French population from staging their own revolution is to start a war with Germany. And that was the war that also ended his rule in the end. And at the other end was Bismarck, with whom Napoleon III occasionally vacationed, we shouldn't forget. But at some point they were both faced with more serious problems, and that was that there was a restive labor movement growing in their countries, and his opponent, Bismarck, did eventually the same that Napoleon III did, which was to mobilize the population and popular emotions behind the idea of foreign expansion. And this is important because it gives you the equation between imperialism on the one hand, so which is not just about conquering colonies and fighting the nasty neighbor, but it's also mobilizing the population for these foreign adventures. And that was something that was shared by all the main European rulers. Now we get to the third point, and the second Marx quote, because in a way, if you read through the Marx Engels Werke edition that I happen to have, there's already a new edition that serious scholars should have, but I invested a lot in this first batch. But if you read it through, you are amazed. How can it be that Marx had such deep insight in the power of the counter-revolution right after 1848, and still continued to stick to the idea that the world was in for this massive process of transformation towards socialism? The second quote is that Marx said on 1848, that England is the rock on which the counter-revolution will build its church. And again, I think that's a very deep insight, because it gives you the idea of the sophistication of the role of England. It began, of course, already with the first Napoleon, when England paid for the armies of the Tsar and the Emperor of Austria-Hungary and so on to defeat Napoleon. But it only became a really sustained process when, after 1848, England became the organizer of the politics of the continent. My idea is that England is the core of a liberal heartland, that is a heartland in the global political economy, which dominates to the present the world economy as a whole, and has the military means to enforce the necessary changes that have to be made to make this world economy work. And that facing this heartland, this liberal space from which capital expands, facing them has have emerged a succession of what I call contender states. And these are states beginning with France already under the Sun King, and followed by the French Revolution, Napoleon, and so on. These are states which have to make up for the fact that they appear late on the world historical stage by concentrating everything that evolved more or less organically in the English-speaking space, making up for that shortfall and that time lag by concentrating all these forces in the state apparatus. So what you see in France, later after unification, in northern Germany, in Japan, eventually in the Soviet Union, and to a considerable extent also in China, and it also holds practically for all third world states, is this concentration of all social intelligence and social initiative in the state. So people in these countries still today expect that if something important is to happen, it will come from the state. You know, if you travel through France as a tourist, you will see big signs which say this bridge has been financed by the state. Well, I can tell you, you can travel through Britain or the United States till your petrol runs out. You will not have seen that sort of sign, because people don't expect those things from the state. They expect them from private business and from society. Now, the reason that I dwell on this a little bit now is because this position of contender state still has a revolutionary ring around about it. So it's still something that resists the West, but it is a fallback position for many revolutions, and it would be a fallback position for the Russian Revolution. Now, from World War I, under President Woodrow Wilson and his brilliant staff of intellectuals who then for the first time constituted a sort of brain trust dedicated to world politics and geography, borders, you name it. From World War I, the West, this liberal heartland, has been able to defeat all revolutions, not necessarily the same week, but you know, over the longer period, by first containing it and then pushing it back into the role of a contender state if it wasn't possible to immediately defeat it, which they of course also tried. Now, I won't be speaking about all aspects as long as I did now, but now we turn to internal counter-revolution. As I said, defeat of the revolution, of an attempt at revolution, is assimilated into a revolutionary theory. Why is that important? Because we tend to think, and rightly so, that when a revolution happens, a large mass of the population is somehow captivated by a sense that things are moving now, and that we will be moving into a different society. That was, of course, the case in the Russian Revolution. I heard from Henry again that in Winnipeg in 1919 there was a complete takeover of the city by revolutionary workers, and you can imagine that these people hadn't been studying Marx and Lenin for many years and then said, well, that we can only come to one conclusion, and that is we have to take over the city. No, this is a sort of spark. You know, consciousness enters into a dimension that didn't exist before, and the question that always arises is not to romanticize about this fantastic revolutionary feeling, but how that relates to the explicit doctrines that have been written down by the people who see themselves as the leaders, or at least as the key supporters of that movement. Now, if the movement suffers a defeat, it tends to result in a rewriting of revolutionary theory, which in the process of rewriting takes its distance from popular consciousness. So revolutionary theory will be again and again surprised by what the people actually do and how they think when a revolution happens. And that happened, for instance, the assimilation of the defeat took place in 1848. Already one of the conclusions of Marx at that juncture was to come up with the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think if you look at the longer experience with socialist revolutions, that may not have been the most happy invention, for the simple reason that the mood of a revolutionary people does not necessarily include the idea of imposing a dictatorship. You know, there are intellectual reasons why you say, well, there has to be a sort of restriction of the freedom of movement of the opposite side. And Venezuela is quite an example of what happens when you don't do that. But It's not, I would say it is a retreat from a really creative and optimistic popular movement. The same with Lenin's idea of the vanguard party. That he came up with the idea that basically the people were already so much encapsulated in the routine of negotiating about wages and secondary labor working conditions, that it was better that the whole revolutionary process and the consciousness that belongs to it is concentrated in this small vanguard and so on and so forth. And that, of course, had a dramatic effect on Bolshevik theory, especially because it was surprised in 1905. You know, Lenin came with his idea of the vanguard party in 1902, and in 1905 there was the first revolution attempt in Russia, and they came up with the idea of the self-governing Soviets. The whole concept of the Soviet Union comes from the Soviet idea, the councils which were self-governing. And against that idea was, of course, the idea that the party governs. So the problem of the later Soviet Union has always been that the concept of the Soviet was used as a label for the whole experience, but the reality was a party dictatorship. And you can trace that back to the rewriting of revolutionary doctrine, which in the process of defeat, assimilating the defeat, took its distance from possible forms of new revolutionary consciousness, which will always surprise us in the way that, let us say, the Iranian Islamic Revolution surprised everybody. That means that that's not that we have to accept that under all circumstances, but it simply means that the root of consciousness is a different one than the root of revolutionary theory. Now that is almost self-evident, but what I want to stress is that it's also an internalization of the counter-revolution, an assimilation of things, of how we must step back. The last point I already mentioned, and that's a geopolitical reduction, and that is that you have an explosion. You know, all revolutions wanted to be world revolutions. The French Revolution was a revolution, at least for Europe, but basically also for Haiti, let's not forget, and Santo Domingo. And yet it ended up as a revolution of France. And that was, of course, because the external counter-revolution immediately closed in on it. The Bolshevik Revolution was also meant as a world revolution. It immediately was attacked from all sides, and Wilson succeeded by defeating Lenin in a sort of contest, also because Lenin may have had his little beard, but Wilson brought food and promises that were largely copied from the Bolshevik program, but then coupled with the wealth and the appeal that the United States had at that time already, and that it still enjoys today, although there's a man with a particular hairdo who's working very hard to limit that appeal, at least compared to what it used to be. Now, practically everything that I want to say about the Russian Revolution I have already said, but I'll just sum it up. Let's not forget that the Russian Revolution happened in between two enormous counter-revolutionary explosions. And of course, everybody will quickly agree that fascism was such a counter-revolutionary process. World War I is much less easy to see that too was a counter-revolutionary episode. I already mentioned that Napoleon III and Bismarck used imperialism as a way out of social tensions. That's not a novel idea. But World War I was, as it were, a collective way out of social tensions in Europe. And at that time, we have, thanks to the work of historians like Fritz Fischer in Germany, we have the documentation of what Emperor Wilhelm II actually wrote on these matters and said on these matters. And in 1905, when the first Russian revolutionary attempt had taken place, Kaiser Wilhelm wrote a telegram to his prime minister in which he said, what we now have to do is to behead the socialist movement and that is, you know, cut the heads of SPD, the Socialist Party in Germany, and then send the workers into the trenches. So then we get a war. So basically what he proposed was to use a big confrontation in Europe, not just as we tend to assume as the sole reason, not just to you know, to get hold of the Balkans for railway expansion, etc. That was also an important part, and defeat France. But it was also to deflect the tensions inside Germany, and to turn that into an inferno of destruction, in which not just the hopes of the whole 20th century, because I shouldn't be carried away on this, but if you just think back of the last decades of the 19th century and the decades leading up to August 1914, you will think of the developments in music, in literature, the developments in basic science. You know, these were promising in combination. New concepts of time. These were promising in combination. The opening up of a new era of new dimensions. You know, new dimension of thought. So when I speak about revolutionary consciousness, it's not just masses of people walking behind red banners. It's also that in the let's say the educated layers of the population, people become aware of completely unforeseen possibilities. Now that was brewing in the decades leading to World War I, and although I doubt whether Kaiser Wilhelm will have experienced these things with the terms that I'm now using, they were aware that the old order was about to, you know, to break up in a massive eruption of popular discontent, and the impossibility of moving on in this old quasi-aristocratic society. And it was not only on the German side. I'm just reading a fantastic book by an Italian, Andrea Bosco, on the Rhodes-Milner group. There are already several books, but this is a new one, 500 pages. So for a long flight, it's an ideal companion. But it's also a brilliant book, and he shows, for instance, that on the British side, the decision to work towards World War I was also a conscious one. And Alfred Milner, the man who handled the legacy of Cecil Rhodes, Alfred Milner actually thought that a big war was necessary to avoid two crises. One crisis was an eruption of civil war in England itself, England plus Ireland, because 40% of the Irish population was Catholic. I was never aware of that, but he thought that social discontent would break up England and Ireland along these lines. And the other thing that he feared, which I can mention here because I'm in Canada, was that the empire, not India, which was treated as a permanent colony and was never credited with any sort of active role, but the white settler dominions were in the process of breaking away from Britain, and that only a big war in which all the people of English stock would be fighting the Hun would keep the empire from breaking up. Now, Andrea Bosco in his book, and I'll stop about it there, but he says that in the end, the project failed completely because Ireland broke away and the empire fell apart. But that doesn't diminish the role on the other side of the key element in the British ruling class, which was the Milner group. And mind you, that Churchill was, for instance, young Churchill was an admirer of precisely these ideas, that played a role in the country which was the most liberal one, and of which we would least expect that it would have such a malicious thought in the back of its head when the possibilities of a big war in Europe were being considered. And I recommend the book very heartily. So World War I was an episode of permanent counter-revolution, I would say, because it mobilized the peoples against their neighbors. It brought out all the forms of inflecting popular discontent into a violent explosion, and yet it was at the same time directed at the physical destruction of everything that was so promising in the decades leading up to the First World War, from things that were promising for the average people, like better wages, better working conditions, to the things that I just mentioned. And if you just see the rupture, for instance, in the history of art, of the optimistic and experimental, optimistically experimental forms of art, and the more bizarre and dark forms that followed the First World War, you can perhaps understand what I mean to say. Fascism was, of course, well, the most extreme form, and I'll come back to that. And here I list the two major defeats. Wilson defeated Lenin, I already mentioned why. And the second major defeat, of course, was the coming to power of Stalin, not coming to power of a particularly vicious person, because that is always secondary in history, but the reduction of the Soviet world revolution to socialism in one country, and Stalin and his entourage of planners and rather crude type of country organizers. They represented that transition, and they had to impose, and then there again you see this tension between retreat in theory and popular consciousness that exploded in the form of a terroristic rule on the population, which in turn was necessary to prepare for the fight against Nazism, of course. And yeah, I never can avoid mentioning that if the Russians wouldn't have sacrificed 50 million people in the fight against Nazism, then I would have been born in Nazi Holland. And whereas now, well, it was something that looked remarkably like Nazi Holland, but it wasn't officially under the Nazis anymore. The reason that I mention that is because if you don't properly understand that, you will become lost in moral questions. Wasn't the Soviet Union in the end a progressive thing because they defeated the Nazis? Yes, but weren't they actually a reactionary thing because they terrorized their own population into submission to actually be prepared for that? And I think that there we should see that there's a difference between, on the one hand, this optimistic world revolution which erupts and which shows you all the signs of the whole romance almost of people taking power in their own hands, and then the reduction to a contender position. But that doesn't mean that all positive qualities that were once part of the revolutionary package have therefore disappeared, you know. But when Stalin mobilized the Soviet Union for the great fight against the Nazis, he also had to step back take a further step back, and that was to actually mobilize nationalism and the Holy Russia sentiment for the great fight. Now, the last disastrous retreat and defeat that the Soviet experience suffered was that it allowed itself to become encapsulated in the national state form, or to become part of the game of power balancing and so on and so forth, and to settle for a mass consumption society, which was, of course, mass consumption of not a very impressive dimensions by our standards, but it meant that from the moment that it was decided to set course for an economic development modeled after that of the West, that basically the goals of the revolution, as it was still called, were being dictated by the opponent. And that is how it ended. I always think of when Gorbachev succeeded in getting one of his last loans from Helmut Kohl and Deutsche Bank, he had to use that and we talked about billions of marks. He had to use that to import cassette tapes, because demand for cassette tapes for popular music had become so urgent that he risked major disturbances if something wouldn't be done on that score very quickly. Now that gives you the sense that, of course, that is not the way to put the fate of the Soviet Union in the balance. Now, we're almost, when you're a speaker and you know there are drinks coming up, you are in a difficult fight. But there are some things that I really want to tell you. And one of them is post-war counter-revolution. Because when we say that after that in the course of the whole process of permanent counter-revolution, and it's permanent in the sense that every episode is linked to the next, whereas the revolutions tend to be much more disjointed, but that's a different matter. But when I said that the West developed this counter-revolution into an art form, then that real development began after the Second World War. Because at the end of the Second World War, there was a deep understanding in American policy-making circles, and as always in British policy-making circles, that counter-revolution should never be allowed to acquire the dimensions that it took with the Axis powers attack on Anglo-America. So Japan, Germany, and Italy should never have the chance to take down the world with them in an inferno of fire and destruction for reasons of counter-revolution. So what had to be avoided at all costs was an uncontrolled process of counter-revolution, and of course the conflict between the Nazis and the rest of Europe, and conflict between Japan and the United States cannot be reduced to this aspect, but it was an important aspect. And the example of Franco Spain was, for instance, much more attractive, having looked at the Spanish Civil War, and then the outcome of somebody who also cut down to size his own fascists to create a stable, self-contained counter-revolutionary state was much more attractive than having another Hitler run amok in the whole international situation. And what you get then in the 1950s to 1970s is what you might call counter-revolution in one country. That is that whenever a movement arises that takes over power or threatens to do so, there is a surgical strike through local forces, ideally, but also by direct intervention, sending in the US Marines, which you can do with Guatemala, but you cannot do that with Indonesia or Brazil, the countries that I mentioned here. Brazil in 1964 is a good example of the United States in the background and the Brazilian ruling class taking power with its support. Indonesia is the same story. Britain and the United States were in the background there wasn't yet, neither in Brazil or in Indonesia, was there a real revolution, but the forces for a profound change were clearly building up. And then we can, of course, take the calendar further and go to Chile in 1973 and Argentina, well, already also in 1973, but 3 years later, formally turning into a military dictatorship. The problem of this counter-revolution, there's no need now to dwell on the terrible consequences of these events, it's a daily topic in the Netherlands because the daughter of one of the real criminals in the whole process of the Argentinian counter-revolution, which included throwing people from planes, torture on an unprecedented scale. But the daughter of one of the leaders of this counter-revolution is actually the Queen of the Netherlands. And today, and she's very charming, she speaks Dutch, so she has won the hearts of the whole country. And to cover her, it is always being said that her father was only a state secretary for agriculture. Of course, nobody explains then that the state secretary for agriculture is actually one of the most central figures in the whole Argentinian power apparatus. But anyway, the problem with counter-revolution in one country in spite of the successes, bloody successes in Chile and other places, let's not forget Uruguay, which had a higher per capita rate of death as a result of a counter-revolution than any other Latin American country. But the problem with that was that it lacked the staying power that was necessary. So Franco Spain was, as it were, closed. They had the sun, so they had tourists and so on and so forth. But these other countries all left behind solidarity committees, people who were upset in Europe and in the United States, nuns who were murdered when they went to Central America in this case. You know, that was not a sort of counter-revolution that you could continue endlessly. And that leads us to the next step. And of course, mind you, that most of the people, thanks to the manufacture of consent, that most of the people, of course, had no idea that these things were happening in Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. Let's not forget that while the generals were throwing people out of planes over the Atlantic Ocean, the World Championships of football took place in Argentina, and one of the, this is my last Dutch anecdote, but one of the comedians of the Netherlands organized a committee that we shouldn't go look at what's happening there, and I think he got 30 signatures, and we of course sent our team, and it got to the finals, and nobody ever heard of what was happening in Argentina. But there were solidarity committees, and of course in due course at some point all these grisly details become known to people, and that leads to the well, still current form of counter-revolution, and that's really a work of genius, which in part arose as a consequence of what had happened in Chile. You may recall that in Italy, the Communist Party, looking at what had happened in Chile, came to the conclusion that it wasn't possible to pursue a revolutionary project against that would pit you frontally against your own bourgeoisie. So, as you all know, Berlinguer came up with the concept of the historic compromise. Mind you, that this is another form of stepping back from a revolutionary theory, because one of the consequences was that on the left of the Communist Party, all kind of groups sprang up, some very serious like the Manifesto and others, but also rather extreme violence-oriented groups like the Red Brigades and Workers' Autonomy and so on and so forth. And in that field of force, a new strategy was being deployed, and that was to arrange centrist, as I put it here briefly, centrist coups against extremist violence, because in Chile, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on, the counter-revolution took the form of being itself the most violent force in the process. So in a very bloody and miserable way, they ended the process of progressive social change that was on the horizon or already happening. Now, the emphasis shifts to creating violence, but using these split-offs from, on the one hand, the Communist Party, you know, the left wing of the Communist Party, on the other hand, fascist group and semi-fascist group, and manipulate them into creating terror attacks, bomb attacks, abductions, you name it. And then a sort of fatigue occurs among the population that they don't want to live in conditions like that. The revolutionaries or quasi-revolutionaries never fail in advertising themselves as communists. You know, the hammers and sickles fly around your ears all the time, because that is the message that they are supposed to send. And the result is that the people become wary of initiatives from those quarters. So the Communist Party was completely immobilized already before even the abduction of Moro. And then a coup d'etat is executed in the name of normalcy. And that is what we have still today. So you have situations, whether it's, for instance, one of the papers that I heard on in the first panel was on how the civil war, how the revolutionary war in Salvador was turned into a civil war. Now, that is a process. That's also part of a process in which you get war fatigue among the population, and they're willing to settle for anything as long as it brings back normalcy. So extremist violence has to be stopped, and the majority has to restore order along normal lines. And these are typically centrist groups. They are not actually centrist, but that is one of the advantages of neoliberalism. You can say, well, this is a technical matter. You know, the economy has to be run by experts, and what politics has to do is to take care of a routine society in which people actually want to live and which is free of this extremist violence. And basically, the whole politics of today is a permanent coup because the war on terror, the state of emergency that has become permanent. In France, it has just been shifted from a constitutional provision to a normal law, so that you're always under that law. In Holland, we have a plan to get blanket surveillance of the population, and all the documentation that is being collected in this way is then passed on to the United States intelligence services, and so on and so forth. So basically what we have now is that you have to identify which forces in society represent extremist violence. Nobody wants violence, nobody wants therefore extremism, and there's a permanent radical center, so to speak, represented by the likes of Blair and Merkel and whoever you want. Well, again, the man with the wave is throwing this process into disarray, but that brings me to my last point. So I hope you see here that there is a process of increasing sophistication of organizing this counter-revolution on a global scale. And of course, I'm very brief here, but the more details you read about that, the more you read about the role of Saudi Arabia as a financier of that, the more you read about the role of Israel as a not just not financier, but a supplier of hardware and intelligence. No country in the world is so specialized in interrogation techniques and crowd control techniques as Israel. And although we tend to think these days that the state of Israel has moved so far to the right that it is isolated internationally, there has just been this fantastic book by an author whose name I now forget, which is about the fact that Israel has military and intelligence connections with 140 states in the world. So they wouldn't advertise that, but it gives you a sense of the centrality of this state. So I mentioned that just to indicate that the real situation is far more complex than I'm sketching it now, but through the whole process you've seen avoiding big bloodbath like the Nazis, going to counter-revolution in one country in which the violence comes from the far right. That is ultimately unacceptable because modern people don't want to live with that sort of thing. And now we have extremist violence, which sometimes is provoked, sometimes is actually organized, but which will also arise from its own accord, for the simple reason that the conditions under which people have to live are growing worse and worse. And then the coup is executed by the radical center. Now this brings me to the last point. Can I still end that very briefly? Because that's the optimistic, you know. There's no, this long evolutionary process in the end never happened. But if the West is the organizer of the revolutionary or the counter-revolutionary process, and supplies, let us say, the permanence aspect, then the fact that today the crisis strikes precisely on this Anglo-American axis is, of course, of enormous importance.
Louder, please.
Sorry?
Louder.
Louder.
Oh, sure. Is it not working anymore?
It's working. Can you closer to you?
Okay. Sorry. The fact that if the West is the organizer of the permanent counter-revolution, to summarize it, The fact that the crisis strikes there at its deepest is of enormous importance. I don't share the idea that China is a bright light on the horizon which will bring, because it still calls itself the Communist Party. I think, yeah, I don't want to insult anyone, but I think that is really a hoax. That doesn't, I mean, they simply haven't come to the point where they think it's worthwhile to change the name of the party. But it's not a Communist Party. I've been there once, and it was not a communist society either. But that is not important. The crisis hits in the West, especially in England and America. And Brexit and the Hillary-Trump race are signs, sure signs of a crisis. And today, the American ruling class has broken up into warring factions, and they fight each other. Also with the so-called deep state. If I would have been speaking here 2 years ago and I would have used the term deep state, many people would have thought, well, this is one of those conspiracy theories, because what is that? Well, today it's in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, everybody talks about it, because it refers at least to the 17 American intelligence agencies, who of course are not there for nothing, and who have a combined budget, I read the other day, which is the equivalent of the total Russian defense budget. So that gives you something like 60 billion on an annual basis. So that gives you some sense of the apparatus that is available, not just for collecting information, but also for the dirty tricks department, well, to send some postcards and deflate some car tires. Now, the nature of the crisis is important to understand here, because we tend to think, we tend to hear that the economy is picking up again, etc. I think that is not the case. The economy is in a capitalist economy is in a terminal crisis, and it has been argued eloquently by many authors, and the one that I'm particularly impressed by is the German director of the Max Planck Institute, Wolfgang Streeck, who says, and many people have said that before, that the crisis set in the late 1960s. The late 1960s is the moment when the post-war economy of Fordism or a mass consumption society, relative welfare state, by the way, that is a form in which in Western Europe and to a lesser extent in the United States as well, the West absorbed and assimilated certain achievements of state socialism in the East. The fact that I could study for nothing, that our medical insurance was almost for nothing, that we had good social security, etc., had to do a lot with the fact that there was a rival system which had this, and of course, you know, no point now going into the details of that. That meant that we had a capitalist society in the West based on a fundamental class compromise, a class compromise that covered entire society, here in Canada, of course, too. That was the capitalism with the human face. And the human face is not known in Latin America or in Indonesia or Vietnam. People wouldn't understand what you're talking about. But in our societies in the West, it did exist, and the reason why it did exist is very understandable, because you can only organize, basically it goes back to one of the first points that I made, you can only organize an imperialist system if you have the population on your side. And that was done by good social security, by rising wages, and by a number of, well, I grew up in a Spartan society, but with an optimistic note. You know, you felt that everything would become better, which is not the same today anymore. Now, capitalism with the human face basically ended in the late 60s, when we had these mass workers' movements, etc. But the thesis by Wolfgang Streeck is that it was prolonged by throwing money into the breaches. So the governments in the West used various ways of enlarging liquidity in the economy, which means the amount of money that circulates, real money or just credit or things that you can use for consumption or for buying a home or whatever, first by inflation, you know, after the collapse, talking about crisis. You know, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 and its partial resurrection in 1973 meant that there was an enormous inflationary wave. That inflation also allowed to prolong the compromise with the Soviet bloc and with the Third World. You know, the new international economic order movement was entirely based on the mass of liquidity that was available in the London euro-dollar and euro capital markets. But in 2008, all these forms of prolonging the compromise in the West collapsed because there's no way left in which you can prolong this central class compromise, which had already been narrowed through various phases. So Streeck says the first phase is inflation, that prolonged the class compromise. The second phase was state debt, so the states became indebted, again with dramatic consequences in the Third World, but fewer consequences in the West. And yeah, today there's no compromise at all, and the free-floating speculative finance today is the dominant fraction of capital. You know, capitalism never exists as a monolithic system. It always imposes its market discipline through a particular coalition of separate groups within capital, so either with industry or the banking sector, or etc., etc. Today, we owe the crisis to the speculators, and the crisis is also being handled by the speculators. There was a fantastic article on Goldman Sachs by the investment bank, also a shadow bank, so-called an unregulated provider of liquidity, in The Intercept, the website of Glenn Greenwald, the guy who gave us a story of Edward Snowden. And they can read how this bank alone played an enormous role in the run-up to the crisis, but also was able to dictate the solution to the crisis. And Obama was part and parcel of that. For instance, he gave the task of restoring financial health to a number of basically bankrupt companies like AIG, the insurance company, to a man named Larry Fink, at that time an upcoming, the owner of an upcoming investment fund, also a shadow bank, so also a provider of extra liquidity. And today, Larry Fink is the richest, the most powerful owner with his BlackRock company. And in Germany, they already write books now which are titled BlackRock Capitalism, as if that is the one solid pillar on which the whole system rests. Important is that in 2008 it is exhausted. There is no longer a capitalism with a human face, which doesn't mean that we can't get safely home tonight, but it means that there's no serious attempt to keep a compromise, a class compromise with the rest of society going. So when today we live in a post-truth environment, it is because the government, also the quality press, can no longer tell us what the real situation is that we are facing. That is no longer possible because the other party would then begin to pose very serious questions. So government and the mainstream media today are the largest and most consistent providers of fake news. Every newspaper that you open, I must say that the Globe and Mail that I read in the hotel is not a bad example in the field, but I can assure you that the mainstream media, where I come from, and certainly the United States with the New York Times and the Washington Post, which even Trump now calls the Amazon Washington Post, but you should also include the CIA, because the CIA and Amazon have concluded a contract that is 3 times the amount of money that Joe Bezos of Amazon paid actually for the Washington Post, but this is anecdote. The point is, the government and the mainstream media are today the providers of fake news, and I don't say that as a mere polemic or to vent my anger or whatever, but it indicates a very profound process, and that is the process of the end of compromise. There is no longer a class compromise, and that means that you cannot openly engage with your own population or even with your own let's say, educated middle class, which still happened in the 1980s, to discuss the main issues of the day. So the whole concept of quality press has lost its meaning. And the end of the story is that we get, and here I could show the other slides again, we get a state of permanent emergency, we get a state of war. And well, we face, according to a book by Jack Rasmus, Systemic Fragility in the World Economy, that I can recommend, we face another explosion far larger than the one of 2008. And then this is a man who writes only about the economy. So he doesn't see that well before that moment, we might already be in a state of war on many more fronts than we are already now. Yeah, and now I'm talking to myself, and I think, should you really end on such a gloomy note? But we still have 2 days to go, and I'm sure that ideas will come up that will amend mine to a considerable extent and restore confidence in the future. But we need it. Thank you.
So in closing, Kees took the one remark I was going to make in lieu of a proper discussion out of my mouth. Because I was going to say, Kees has just set us the task of finding hope out of the layer upon layer of doom and gloom he has laid upon us. So, but nevertheless, I think it's intellectually extremely stimulating talk, and I know you have a lot of questions, which is why I decided to confine my remarks just to that.
It's quite extraordinary to listen to your gloom and doom. It would sound even better in German. But I'm concerned about the main thrust of your talk and the nature of this conference. Around the world today, there are millions of people who have actively engaged, not simply in revolution, but are building alternative societies. And they have said something akin to, stop the world, we're getting off. Perhaps it's appropriate to use that term in the nature of the Broadway show of that name. I am troubled, and I express my trouble to the whole audience, because my concern is the nation state that you're so negative about, and the analysis, is the framework of the nation state still the appropriate unit for talking about whether we can have change? The millions of people, and I would venture to say the hundreds of millions of people who are currently engaged in building alternative societies on the margins of capitalism. The hundreds of millions of people who are actively engaged in producing a world for themselves which is much better, and who are doing so while caring for the planet, which seems to me extraordinarily important, are engaged in not an experiment, but are engaged in rebuilding their corners of the world in, I think, probably all the continents. And so without asking you to comment on how successful each one of those experiments is, I would like to ask the audience and you whether perhaps we're going on the wrong unit of analysis. Perhaps it is no longer the nation state. Perhaps it is no longer the possibility of global governance. Perhaps it is no longer the question of how, as a world community, we're going to go about building things. But the extraordinary optimism that comes from Mandar obedeciendo of the Zapatistas, the buen vivir in Ecuador, el vivir bien from Bolivia, the MST, or the 200 million members of the Via Campesina who are actively engaged in food sovereignty today, or perhaps even surprisingly, in the midst of whatever you would characterize as going on in China, the 200 million families who are rebuilding rural China today, perhaps that is the revolution we're talking about.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't go down well if I just denigrate the things that you mentioned here. But I would also say that if so many people in the third world today say stop the planet, we want to get off, it is also because the real economy has less and less need for labor. It has need for raw materials and all kinds of resources. It has less and less need for labor in the third world countries, which is one way of explaining the migration waves to the West, because there's no livelihood for people left. So while I, like you, sympathize with the Zapatistas, etc., yeah, my hunch would be that the moment they are seriously approaching state power and would be able, for instance, to take Mexico or part of Mexico out of NAFTA, something else would happen that would sadden you and me likewise, I think. So the nation state is, yeah, we can bemoan it, but it is still the place where the laws are enacted. And if you want to change something and you have built up sufficient support in whatever way, the end of the line is, and as I said, we just have this law in Holland now about, and we're organizing a referendum against it, about eavesdropping on everybody's communications. That happens at the level of the state, and there's no other level which is remotely as important as that. And that also explains why in Spain today the police is being sent to Catalonia, because they don't want the authority of the state challenged along those lines, you know, apart from the merits of the case. So I share your hunger for, I wish I could see something that was really promising, but in Latin America, as far as I can see, we see a massive rollback now of all the hopes that were kindled in the in the first decade of the 21st century, when Chavez was still around, when Monthly Review was writing monthly pieces, you know, how Chavez was learning and studying and flying to Cuba to let Castro explain everything, etc. Well, he's dead, his successor is in deep trouble. Well, I don't have to tell you the story here. So, you know the famous phrase by Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I wouldn't be here if to hold the sort of talk that I just did if I wasn't firmly convinced that there are still people and that are encouraging and inspiring around the world to do things that are extremely important. But we must first understand the real situation that we are in, and not a situation that I think is too dependent on our goodwill and sort of romantic empathy with very courageous initiatives in the countries that you know better than I.
I'm not going to make a speech, I'm going to ask a question. You talked a lot about the contender states, and then you talked about the organization of counter-revolution by Wilson and the United States, but you missed the United States as a contender state, and in your series of bourgeois revolutions, the American Revolution didn't appear. And this seems like a big elephant in the room, and I'd like to hear about it.
Actually, I forgot to mention, I can show you the paper that in the list of bourgeois revolutions preceding 1848, I actually had the American secession also on my list, but somehow I skipped it. And the United States was a contender state very briefly, you know, when after the Civil War it instituted protectionism to allow its industries to mature. But even then, British money capital and Dutch money capital flowed in massively to finance the railway expansion of that period. And in 1823, at the latest, with the Monroe Doctrine, Britain and the United States joined forces again. Then still only with respect to Latin America, but with Wilson it became a global project of Anglo-American projection of Anglo-American power and imposing on the world their specific sense of organization. And yeah, I'm always very captivated by the last book that I have in my hands, but this book by Andrea Bosco is really an amazing work because it gives you quotes that show you the depth of conviction of these leaders of the British bourgeoisie, who are far more sophisticated, I think, than their American counterparts, who still have this sort of naive idealism that runs through their machinations. But the Milners of this world had a conception which almost is seducing in its religious fervor, of that if only the whole world took on British-style civilization, there would be no more wars, the whole world would live in harmony, well, there I stop. But yes, the other points that you mentioned, every historical account that sweeps over the subject matter with the speed that I did now, of course, opens up to questions like you just posed about the role of the United States. But don't forget that today, the real difference between China and the West, and China plus the rest of the BRICS, is that the West has now completely surrendered to independent finance. So according to Rasmus, something like 25 to 40 trillion has been pumped into the banks first to recapitalize them, and then to continue to get them to lend to the real sector, except they don't do that because the financial sphere has completely become completely independent of the real economy. The BRICS, on the other hand, still have a strong element of prioritizing the real economy, and the One Belt, One Road project, for instance, is an enormously important venture in that respect. I wouldn't call that socialist, but it's typically a contender state, so it's a different form of capitalism.
There are lots of questions, and we will take this a little bit over time, but and I think that's a good thing because we're really warming up to some really important and essential questions. So, but without taxing Kees too much. So, Henry.
Well, I thought your talk was very interesting. The way especially toward the end, the way you describe the buildup of the repressive apparatus of counter-revolution. And indeed, one could write a history, one should write, I'm sure there have been histories written, of counter-revolution beginning from Metternich onwards. But I'm reminded of in an existential way, what happened in 2008, and many people here will remember that, in that we were told again and again and again that, the boom would go on forever, and it was onward and upward, and our professors were telling us, you know, that it all was working perfectly. And suddenly in 2008, we had, surprise, a collapse. And I would suggest that the establishment has been surprised again and again over this long period. The Metternichians were surprised by the revolution of 1848. The people who started World War I were surprised by the extraordinary outcome of World War I. It was a counter-revolutionary war, and the same is true of the Second World War. The outcome was communism sweeping the whole of Eurasia. And likewise, the Vietnam conflict. And I think that what we're seeing as you have indicated, we're seeing an incredible buildup of counter-revolution. These people must be preparing themselves for something. And I believe they're correct, because for every action there is a counteraction. And what is preparing, in my view, is these forces are building up on a world scale. And there must be an explosion. And I would say, just as I too admire the extraordinary refinement of the counter-revolutionary apparatus, you can't deny the intelligence of the people who are directing this. They all go to the elite schools, and they know everything. But the fact of the matter is that the revolutionary process that we've seen is also a learning process. And I would say that we learn and we fail and we learn again. And I would not, as some here today have, sort of write off the revolutionary experience that we've had, and indeed the form of the party. Now, the party is a work in progress. Time and again, parties have been created. I'm finished. That are they were failures. But what we must do is create a successful example of a party. That is to say, a party that is democratic and ecologically minded. And I think the work of organization, the micro work that activists do all over the world, plants ideas, plants seeds in people, just as it happened during the Bolshevik Revolution. There was a long preparation, and I think we're seeing that today. And we need a stronger dose of revolutionary optimism.
Things have changed since Russian Revolution of 1917. The idea was that you break away from global capitalist economic system in isolation and opposition to it, you can grow and outstrip it ultimately. That was the ideal. But we also talked about Chinese economic miracle that without its revolution of 1949 would not have happened. But we also know that Chinese economic miracle has been possible because of its return to the embrace of global capitalism, not in opposition to it. Given that those lines have been blurred, given that there is economic interdependence globally and the scheme of original socialism cannot be carried out in 21st century, what do you see to be the future of both socialism and revolution in light of several trends? Global transition of power that is taking place to the detriment of the United States and rise of China, rise of what we call non-polarity or a multipolar world simultaneously, and then we also have rise of populist right and the way that right-wing activists are organizing themselves in a very concerted and resourceful manner. How do you see the future if you have to look at your crystal ball based on your analysis of the past?
Kees, would you like to reply now?
Yeah, no, I have to must think in briefly. I think the mobilization of the far right is a perverse expression of popular discontent. And it manifests itself against things like migration, which is part of the internationalization of capital, except it is the human side in which it's very difficult emotionally to raise your voice against it. You know, that makes, for people who think, makes it very difficult to complain about migration, but the problems are real. That is important, and the people who are not inhibited by the sort of intellectual legacy that we have express that in sometimes very ugly ways. Marx said in Capital Volume 3 that the end of, in a passage very often overlooked, that the end of capitalism will come when two things happen. One is that the capitalism ends in an orgy of swindle, which will interrupt the elementary supply of foodstuffs to the cities and so on and so forth, and will force the governments, irrespective of their color, to intervene to secure production. That's the one element. Now, we have the swindle, we have half-hearted responses to it, but the big response will come when the big crisis will come, if it comes, which I don't hope, because I'm also dependent on the pension. The other element that he mentions is that the workers develop the ability to organize production on their own. They don't need managers, they don't need the stock exchange, and basically that's also the point that David raised, that so many people are already organizing their own lives. Partly that is because the working conditions of many people and all kinds of forms of hidden unemployment force people to shift from wage labor to independent contractors. And there are many independent contractors now who take a step away from the market economy simply because the market economy has kicked them out. And they fight to enter it again. But in the process of doing that, you see initiatives like organizing their own medical insurance, mutual and self-help organizations. And it may be that in due course these things will become more important, but I'm not sure. My crystal ball is misty on that topic.
Thanks, Paul Kelly from Athabasca University. I think that putting a focus on counter-revolution as a concept is extremely salutary. I think it's helpful in terms of thinking through some of that, and I have, while you were speaking, one specific example came to mind that's very relevant to North America, which was the counter-revolution against the civil rights movement in the United States. And it really was a counter-revolution. It was the prisons, the racist prison state, the new Jim Crow that Michelle Alexander talks about. That's a counter-revolution against the big upsurge of the 60s. But in that context, I have some thought, maybe to get some thoughts about the relationship between that kind of counter-revolution and mass struggle and political consciousness. And this is where I'll take a stab at this question of hope, because I get my hope in this context from a fellow named Colin Kaepernick. Because Colin Kaepernick, who was the football player who took a knee against police racism last year, very isolated at the time. But today, in the National Football League, there are hundreds and hundreds of football players who are protesting openly against police racism. And this is extraordinary because there's a direct parallel. Back at the moment of the last upsurge in the 60s, Tommy Smith and John Carlos put up their fists in the 1968 Olympics, but they didn't get the same kind of mass response in professional sports as is happening today. We're having a bigger response today in 2017 than 1968. So something's going on. There's an intersection between these Black Lives Matter, etc., is on the streets. So some comments about the intersection between big moments of counter-revolution, but then struggle and political consciousness.
Yeah, well, I'll be very brief because people are beginning to dream of a cool drink now. But this is, of course, very important. And mind you that in the late 1960s, when Martin Luther King was killed and several of the leaders of the black movement were killed, you also see the high point of the development of black music, which I think is the greatest contribution of North America to world culture, especially jazz. You know, and after 68, 69, there has been no new development in jazz any longer, and it comes back later as rap, and which I think is, musically speaking, on a much lower level. So I shouldn't expand on that here, but just indicate that political developments can also be read from cultural developments. And you don't have to wait till people are marching through the street behind a red banner to see that something constructive is being developed in the bosom of society, as it did in the 1960s. I think at that time we had to do, we were dealing with a much more ambitious and culturally aspiring black movement than we are today. That's my personal sense, but I should stop there because it's really beyond my knowledge.
Yes, Kim Ives, Haiti Liberté newspaper in New York, in Port-au-Prince. I would question your assessment that Wilson defeated Lenin. I mean, Wilson said famously, trying to stop revolutions is like trying to sweep back the ocean with a broom. And I think that's exactly what this last century has been. Granted, we're celebrating the centenary of the Russian Revolution, but at the same time, we could say that was the period also when finance capital was consolidating its rule, with J.P. Morgan and Carnegie and the rest all developing and building their machine, which has dominated this last century of capitalism. Granted, they've developed very sophisticated mechanisms for undermining, sabotaging, beating back the revolutions, but I think they are, just like the oceans, still coming. I mean, in Haiti, you know, we're watching it come back. Everybody said, oh, geez, it's over. The neo-devaluists have come and reclaimed power through elections, which, again, is a very sophisticated machine. In Haiti, they call it the laboratory. Devised to take elections and beat back the elections, which Haiti first did in 1990 with Aristide and Chavez and Morales and so on and so forth. So, you know, they're always responding, but the people are always responding back. And so I wouldn't be discouraged at all. I mean, as Mark Twain said, there are three types of untruth: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think we're looking at statistics, we're looking at a down jack, but if we look from a farther back, we're going to see that the general progression is going up in terms of structure.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with your doom and gloom perceptions of the market capitalist financial system. Last I heard, this year we're headed to a $4 trillion money printing operation, and with interest rates at all levels going up gradually, the system will basically be swallowed into overwhelming debt. Now, you can look at that as doom and gloom, but at the other hand, as you even mentioned just to a previous question, the alternatives developing to the financial system are growing out of necessity, and of course necessity is usually what spurs on alternative revolutionary movements. And I think instead of looking at it from a doom and gloom perspective, we have to be looking at it from a positive perspective of investigating, analyzing what these alternative financial, real economic processes are, and coming from a perspective of, for example, a family living in a town of 50,000 people in Guatemala, as an example. If the financial marketing system goes down, it won't affect the people at all. They are developing a totally alternative economic system amongst themselves. And at the same time, not only are they developing that at a level of family and families in a community, they're building an organization federally throughout the country. The problem, so that's room for great hope. The problem is that whatever marginal experiments are going on in the West and in North America, they aren't organized at all. And I think it's important for a revolutionary perspective to be looking at these alternatives and encouraging them, analyzing them, writing about them, and encouraging the development of organization of the people who are the producers of this process.
Thank you. You talked about 1848 as a breaking point in creating the counter-revolution. But I'm wondering what you will think about what was called the Arab Spring uprisings, because in my opinion that also created a sort of puncture in what the world was thinking about this region as some sort of a timeless swamp where all you have to do is to rub a lamp like Aladdin and someone is going to appear from the sky, some bombs maybe, or some dictator. Even Thomas Friedman was writing about this region that you need an iron fist. And no matter what you may say has happened since then in the Arab world, I would say that like 1848, there a lot of hope was created in that region. I mean, Tunisia, Egypt, they were all very massive police states. And I think it was no mean achievement, and people actually sacrificed their lives, and there were actually real people involved in these uprisings. And this was a region about which people had given up. I mean, people were saying history has bypassed this region, and perhaps these rulers are going to die in office. And I don't know what you would make of that, but I think this is a very real example of what people can achieve on their own, and they don't have to depend on bombs or lamps rubbed by Aladdin or something like that, or divine intervention to deliver them from dictatorships. Secondly, just a couple of days ago in Saudi Arabia, we heard that driving rights have been given to the women, and I'm not sure what where this comes from, but surely this must categorize as some sort of improvement. You mentioned Saudi Arabia in a couple of lines, but surely, I mean, this is some sort of pressure being applied to that society, not externally, because when Hillary Clinton went there and said, please give these women driving rights, that request was not granted to her, but now, so I would be interested why you missed out on the Arab world, and and it's pretty typical actually when we talk about the great revolutions of the 20th century to actually miss out on this whole region and not to really take these things into account. So I would be interested in what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Last question.
Hi, my name is Jeremiah. So I also sort of wanted to follow up on what you said on 1848 as the configuration of imperialism and counter-revolution. Because something I've noticed in my studies is that if you go, for example, to the French Revolution, one of the moments where the counter-revolution crystallized was exactly Napoleon sending troops to Haiti. And the fact that although there was questions going around of whether France could have, and French colonies could have slaves, France never decolonized during the period of the French Revolution. Or even going back further to the English Civil War, one of the ways Cromwell broke the New Model Army and the uprising of the Levellers was actually sending the New Model Army to Ireland and Scotland to break the rebellions in those countries. So the configuration of imperialism and counter-revolution, I think, is actually a longer history than just starting at 1848. So whether or not you just arbitrarily chose 1848 or whether you hadn't thought further.
1848 is the moment when a long line of counter-revolution or actually anti-revolution. Whenever you want to change something fundamentally, people are upset and will resist. But 1848 is the moment when, with the arrival of the organized labor movement as an independent political player, the threat to the capitalist system of property, which is crystallizing at the same moment, in the same phase, becomes more acute. Until then, you might say counter-revolution depends on the talents of the politicians in power. After 1848, it becomes more of a systemic phenomenon in which leaders learn from each other. I just read a book about the holidays that Bismarck and Napoleon III had together, in which they discussed these matters as you know, as politicians who would later wage war on each other for precisely that reason. But yeah, I should stop because the beauty of history is that the more you know about things, the more you make objections like the one you make now, the more you were forced to deepen your analysis, also make it less schematic, as I had to do now. So I yield on that point. And it's the same with the Arab Spring. I would say just this, that one of the remarkable things of the Arab Spring was that at first it seemed as if it would lead straight to democratic transformation. And of course that in the Arab world will always be with the Muslim Brotherhood or so. I never understood, but we in Western Europe had Christian democracy for 5 decades. Nobody ever complained that that was a mixture of religion and politics. So of course it was. And now, what else would we expect from the Middle East? But the remarkable, striking, the speed at which the counter-revolution struck in these cases. I saw that you were giving also a paper on Yemen. If you just think what has happened to that poor part of the world in terms of counter-revolutionary interventions, what happened to Libya, basically, kicking in the door of North Africa and then walking away. You know, but the idea that something progressive might crystallize, forget it. Now, Egypt is under its dictatorship. Syria is completely destroyed. One of these days, Israel will attack Iran or Lebanon, and we are even further away from home. So I say optimism of the will, but it needs a lot of energy against all the facts that you have to register and to look at coolly to maintain that optimism, but still we can't do without it.